various speakers. We're going to be touching on the promotion to access to information. We're going to be talking about elections and a number of different really engaging critical topics that are relevant to these conversations today. So without taking up much more time, I would like to welcome back Noor on stage, who will be facilitating the quickfire discussions. Thank you, Noor.
Thanks, Tandy. I'm sure many of you are tired of seeing my face up here, but I promise I'll be done after this next session. So our next session is basically, as Tandy mentioned, a quickfire input session, and it's essentially a session which we is going to bring together leading experts in different fields to talk about some very interesting topics. So I'm actually going to ask all of the people that are supposed to be part of the session just to join me on stage. It is going to be a very quick fire session. I'm going to be ruthless with the time. Everyone has 10 minutes to do their presentations. So we have Cassandra, Francis, Advocate Tlakula, Patiswa, Sandra, and Avni. Yes. Okay, great. So the Okay, awesome. Okay, so the first inputs that we'll be getting for this session are going to be from Advocate Pansy Takula, who is the chairperson of the Information Regulator, and she will be touching on understanding PIA and how the Information Regulator can help, and this is specifically help journalists. So, Advocate Takula, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I would like to apologize up front because I'm going to speak, and with your indulgence, maybe take questions if there are any from the floor, and then I'm going to leave because I'm traveling this afternoon out of the country. The Information Regulator, as we all know, is an organization that was established in 2016, and it is responsible for two rights, data protection or protection of personal information, and the right of access to information, and it consists of 5 members. In fact, one of my colleagues is actually here. So I just want to talk about procedural aspects of getting information from the Information Regulator by everyone, and what we are seeing as we try to enforce the Act. But preface that by saying that the Promotion of Access to Information Act, or PAIA, as it is called in South Africa, is really ahead of its time. It was, of course, it has to be amended and to be brought, in line with the digital developments. But however, it is one of the few in the world that applies to both public bodies and private bodies, in the sense that anyone can ask for any information from a public body, from a private body. The only, I think, condition for accessing information from a private body is that the request of that information must prove that they require that information to protect or exercise any right. But now what we are seeing is that when people submit because the process is as follows. If you want to access information, you have to request that information first from a private body or a public body, and you have to use Form 2. And I'll tell you why you have to use Form 2. And you have to exhaust internal remedies. For a public body, it means you lodge that your request with the information officer. If they refuse, then if it's a government department, then it goes to the minister. And the information officer will be the DG. That's only then you can come to the Information Regulator. With a private body, like the media, obviously there is no internal appeal. So if the media requests information from the information regulator, if they request information from the body, if they fail, they have to come to the information regulator first before they approach the courts. I think this is important because this is what the courts have said, that you can't go to court if you're a private body without first coming to the information regulator. The second thing is that you have to use the correct form. If you come to us, you must use Form 5. If you had not used Form 2 when you approached the body, then we also cannot accept your complaint. So these procedural aspects are very, very important. The second thing that I want to say is that I know that there are a number of media bodies that have lodged complaints with the information regulator, and there have been delays, and they have written to me to say, what is it that you are doing? So I need to explain that a complaint is lodged with the administration, the PIA division. Thereafter, it goes to the enforcement committee, which is the committee made up of outsiders. From the enforcement committee, it comes to the members, the commissioners, and we make the final decision. So because of that, there has to be so-called Chinese walls between all of us. We cannot interfere with the investigation because eventually we have to take the final decision. We cannot even interfere with the information, with the enforcement committee, because also the enforcement committee is independent. So I needed to clarify this because, you know, I receive a lot of requests or complaints from the media that have lodged the complaints with the information regulator. What are the weaknesses that we see in the implementation or enforcement of the Act? The information holders abuse the grounds for refusal, especially the POPIA one. If somebody asks for information and then a government department will say we cannot disclose that information because it contains personal information, or it will endanger national security or commercial secrets or something like that. But our courts have been very clear. You can't just recite the Act and say, I cannot disclose information because it will endanger national security. You have to say how. If you haven't said how, then you have not discharged that, the applicability of that ground for refusal. I think it's important to say that. And we see a lot of this. The second witness in the Act is the 180 days, because after the regulator has taken a decision that information has to be disclosed, the holder of information has 180 days within which either to disclose the information or to challenge our decision in court, because our decisions are binding. 180 days is 6 months. It's a long time. So I think that's another weakness that we have to look at going forward, looking at per year. The second one is that if the 180 days passes and our decision have not been challenged in court, what is the next step? We have to open a criminal case against the information officer, which we have done. But the information remains undisclosed. So what's the point of opening a criminal case against the information officer when the information remains undisclosed? In the country such as ours, which is so crime-ridden, you think that police officers are going to investigate a case of some information officer somewhere who did not disclose the information when they are unable to investigate murder cases? It's not going to happen. So that's another weakness in the Act. And maybe what the decision that we are about to take is that even as we open a criminal case, we probably have to disclose the information. So, as I wind up and coming close to the issue of information integrity, you can never talk about information integrity and countering disinformation and misinformation, or even accessing data, if digital platforms are not brought within the fold of access to information. I have said this, and there are people here, I see, there's William, I saw Isaac, internationally, everywhere. I have said this, and no one is listening, to say access to information laws globally are no longer fit for purpose because they require information from public bodies. Information is held by digital platforms, and to get data, you have to get data from them. I said this at the G20 preparatory meeting in Brazil. I have said it also now at the International Day of Universal Access to Information in the Philippines 2 weeks ago. I said, I will say this until I retire or I die. And what happens is that I say it, but when there is, say, a declaration or statement that comes out of any conference, that is excluded. Digital platforms are not included. Nobody's prepared to include them globally. What is the reason? Is it embeddedness? I don't know, and that's where I'm going to do. And this is a fight that we must fight as South Africans because we have received prior requests from media houses requesting information from almost all the digital platforms in South Africa. All of them except Google refused to disclose information and said PIA does not apply to them and they do not have we don't have jurisdiction. Even if that information related to South African elections. And what we have decided to do, we need to test this in court to check whether indeed you can be in South Africa, operate in South Africa, collect information, and then say the South African law does not apply to you. I think the courts must assist us in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Advocate Lekula. And as she mentioned, she does need to leave soon. So just for her inputs, we're going to do a round of questions quickly first, and then we will move on to the next speaker. So I see 2 hands already, and I think those are the only 2 hands that we will take. So Isaac, and then here. Okay, I see a 3rd hand in the back, so only 3 hands that we will take. Quick, short questions, please. Yeah.
Even after I leave, my colleagues are still here after I leave, so if there are questions after I leave, they'll be able to take them.
Thank you, Advocate Lekula. I want to ask a question about universal access to public interest news in the digital age. And the reference you made to PIA that needs to be updated. Do you think that part of the new PIA, the one that's made fit for purpose in the digital age, should include the right to the public to use digital public infrastructure to access news or content both by state entities and by private news suppliers, for instance. So do you think that digital public infrastructure could be used by the media in future to, as part of a media viability issue, to distribute their content and for the public to have the right to accept that or to get the news via digital public infrastructure? Thanks.
Good morning, panelists. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that data platforms remain excluded. What happens in instances where there's a court order for the information to be disclosed, especially when it comes to cases where there's CSAM, so child sexual abuse material, and in cases of revenge pornography? Are they required? Because I know most of them have some sort of memorandum of understanding with some of the regulators, including the FPB and what's the other one? But yeah, that's the one that's coming in mind in terms of disclosing certain information around the anonymity of the perpetrators of CSAM as well as revenge pornography. Thank you.
Good day, colleagues. Advocate Lekula, I just want to raise an issue in relation to data sovereignty. Do we as South Africans have control over our data? Does it reside within our borders? What are the risks? Gauteng is going to come up with new number plates for vehicles. And already there are concerns being raised that it will be generating a lot of data. And then where does that data get stored? Thank you.
Let me start with the last question because it's important. I think our data is all over the place. I think there's no data sovereignty in South Africa. We have to accept that. And that is why we are a victim of so much identity theft and everything that goes with it. And it's one, I mean, we need to look at this issue. I know that I'm talking subject to correction, that there is I thought there was a data center that was being built, or whether it's there and it's functioning. I think somebody will talk about this and see whether it assists us in attaining data sovereignty in this country. Now, the question asked by Isaac, yes, the question is yes, but that has to be subject to the protection of personal information. So even if data is released, for whatever purpose, we need to ensure that that data does not include personal data. I think the problem that we have in this country is that there are a lot of projects on digitalization which are going on, and nobody is talking about the relevance of POPIA in those projects. I mean, for instance, I went to Addis Ababa for a conference of ID for Africa. At that conference, I heard that we are introducing a digital ID for the first time. And no one, when South Africans were presenting from the presidency, and we have not been consulted as the information regulator on the POPIA implications of digitalization. And this is what is going on even on the issue of the digital infrastructure that you are talking about. So that's something that we need to look at as the information regulator. But we find that we have to insert ourselves and force ourselves into discussions and say, hello, we are here, can we look at POPIA implications? And it's ongoing. If I heard your question, whether it related even also to that issue where the Minister of Justice wanted to release, is it connected to that? Yeah, the register of perpetrators of sexual offenses. I mean, people thought that we are against that as the regulator. We're not. We're simply saying to the minister that the legislation that, I can't recall the name of the legislation, it prevented her from doing that. It said the register of sexual offenses is confidential and cannot be disclosed. So you have to deal with that aspect first and amend the legislation to make it possible to disclose. And once the legislation has been amended, then we'll come in and look at the compliance of that legislation with POPIA, whether it requires excessive processing of personal information or not. I mean, that will be the analysis that we have to do. But at this moment, all that we said to the minister was that you cannot release this information because your own legislation prevents you from doing that. So, I think I have done my bit. Public service.
Sure. Thank you, Advocate Lekula. We're doing things a bit backward. We are going to do a panel picture while she is still with us, and then we will carry on with the rest of the session. I'm so sorry about that. Thank you. And I do acknowledge the other commissioners from the Information Regulator who are in the room with us. So if there are any other questions related to the PAIA and PAPIA or anything related to that, I'm sure that they can take them. So moving swiftly into our next session, or next speaker, which is going to be navigating elections in the digital age. And to take us through that is Avni Singh, who is an attorney of the High Court of South Africa, specializing in constitutional law, digital rights, and press freedom, as well as a certified mediator. She focuses in particular on the intersection of regulation, technology, and human rights, which brings together her 15 years of experience in litigation, research, advocacy, policy development, and capacity building. Welcome, Avni. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, no, can we just get the slides up?
It's, I think, the other set of slides. This is for Sandra. Okay, there we go.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Media Monitoring Africa for inviting me to speak in this quick-fire session today. The reason for the title is that when we think about mis and disinformation, the World Economic Forum has identified disinformation as the most significant short-term risk at the end of 2024 and the third most significant long-term risk for the same period. And we know that this is a complex, challenging area. The actors on the other side, or whoever they may be, are well-resourced. They are powerful. They have this Hydra-esque quality to them, where just as we feel like we're making inroads, so too are there new aspects to it. For instance, at the end of 2022, when ChatGPT suddenly came onto the market as this readily accessible, free-to-use tool with no safeguards or guardrails put in place, the nature of the landscape changed so dramatically that conversations that were being had in terms of making inroads into the issues around disinformation were almost outdated as quickly as you could say thank you to ChatGPT for something or other that it had done. And what makes it more challenging, though, is that a large element of this is the invisibility of the players that come to the fore. What we don't see is perhaps part of the greatest challenge and the greatest risk that disinformation currently poses to democracy, to democratic processes and institutions, and to elections. And this plays out in different ways. There are the invisible actors, the coordinated networks, the inauthentic behavior, the botnets, users accessing profiles under either fake names or entirely anonymously. There's the invisibility of the algorithms, the recommender systems, which we have very little to no control over as the users, let alone someone like a qualified or trained editor to help curate the value or the utility of the information. And there's the invisibility of the amplification. This seemingly organic threads that become amplified and perpetrated over and over again to make us believe that this has actually formed part of the commonplace narrative, are often manufactured, coordinated, targeted with alarming specificity in order to promote particular fringe narratives or controversial topics that lend themselves to people's fears, their insecurities, their biases, and individual sentiments. At the core of all of this, what makes these discussions, albeit complicated but essential, is the question of human rights. Ultimately, that is what is at stake if we don't continue to forge ahead in trying to combat the scourge of disinformation. And it's that underpinning that I want you to bear in mind as we proceed on this today. The idea of a single tweet that could change a nation sounds dramatic, but it's not that far-fetched. Think of it as being akin to a spark that starts a wildfire. except in this case, the spark is only 160 characters long, but enjoys the benefit of the false amplification, the manipulation, and the resources that many on the other side don't have. It plays out in a number of different ways. It starts with a tweet or a post. Sometimes it could be just one individual. Sometimes it comes from somebody like a family member inadvertently sharing it. What complicates this further, though, is, as Advocate Lakula has already spoken to, this massive asymmetry of power that we're currently experiencing, where we have, where in general, there is rather limited access to the data being held by social media platforms, but even more so for countries in the global south like South Africa. In fact, South Africa is in a better position because we do have some of the platforms located here, but even then. And speaking to the question that was just raised just now about court orders, it's a really important question because actually what we're seeing is that the platforms have been incredibly inconsistent in their approaches. By and large, they insist that they will only disclose if there is a court order that quite specifically complies with their internal policies and processes, a laborious, time-consuming process that largely becomes very difficult to navigate. But when it suits their interests, they do engage on a voluntary basis, which they claim is non-precedent setting. So on the one hand, we have this asymmetry of power where we're very much in the hands of the platforms with very little knowledge about what they're doing. On the other hand, those countries that we had previously seen as allies in this conversation are also falling by the wayside. While the United States seems en masse to have got distracted by a bumblebee and wandered off, forgetting about human rights, the European Union has until now been quite a key part of these discussions. And the trickle-down effect of the regulations in the EU has had positive benefits for other countries. Unfortunately, this week sees the next round of consultations coming around on the simplification of the General Data Protection Regulation and the Artificial Intelligence Act. In practice, what that's doing is removing a number of the safeguards that were put in place because of the counter-narrative coming out that the EU is a nanny state stifling innovation in a way that they will no longer be competitive with the US. And as a result of that, every user's rights will suffer as a consequence. By way of example, I want to point you to this very peculiar case of Eric Tucker. Eric Tucker was no one in particular. He had roughly 40-ish followers on X at the time that he posted this particular tweet. He took a picture of trucks driving into his hometown and claimed that here are the buses here are the fake protesters, fake anti-Trump protesters being bussed in. Despite his 40 followers, the tweet received 16,000 retweets and was shared 350,000 times on Facebook. The information proved to be completely false. A similar incident had already been debunked by the New York Times the previous week, though it didn't get the same kind of traction. And actually, it was a conference for a large car manufacturer that was bringing in their staff members from all over the country. He posted the correction, and the correction only received 29 retweets in comparison. That speaks to a number of things, both user attitudes and so forth, but also to the kinds of content and the amplification that we see. Ultimately, underpinning all of this is this model of the engine for engagement. These invisible forces at work that play a key part in why this model is so profitable, so powerful, and ultimately so opaque in its disclosure. We have seen time and again studies showing that the likelihood of republishing or of retweeting a correction is at least 7 to 16 times less likely than the initial lie that was posted. It's coordinated, it's complicated, but ultimately it serves a broader purpose for whichever particular interests are at stake. I want to quickly touch on this because ultimately what this speaks to is who it is who's benefiting from this particular model. And broadly speaking, there are at least 4 categories of people. There could be, in the context of elections, the political rivals who want to undermine their opponents or garner favor for themselves. There are interest groups, lobbyists, and so on who want to push a particular narrative, sway a particular conversation. There may be foreign actors who benefit from the instability in a particular country. And as the doyen sitting above all of these, there are the social media companies which have developed the model very specifically and very deliberately in a profit-driven manner where this level of engagement, the targeting, the flagrant ignoring of human rights for the benefits that they derive are at the source of it. Culprits who are able to get away with it with little to no accountability or oversight. And we see this playing out in a number of different ways. The disinformation may play on people's sentiments, their fears, as we said. One of the most concerning parts of disinformation is not simply the outright denial of a particular fact, but it is the information flood, this infodemic that overwhelms the public, that confuses them with so much content that they don't know what to believe. And as a result of that, people become entirely apathetic to the issue. They don't know which way to go. They're overwhelmed, understandably so. It's exhausting in this age where you are faced constantly with a barrage of information on so many different topics. And so people don't heed the warnings that are put out there. They kind of sit on the fence. They really stop paying attention to it. They decide that no one really knows the answer. And as a result, significant consequences may follow. And so just finally, I want to point to some of the actions that are currently being undertaken. There are a number of initiatives, Media Monitoring Africa, together with the Independent Electoral Commission being key among them. And really, if you are interested in this area of work, please reach out to William or myself, because there are a lot of exciting initiatives that we're trying to carve out going forward. But I want to flag one thing. Just because the problem is daunting, it's overwhelming and large, just because we may not be able to fix it, doesn't give us the leeway to walk away from it without trying. For all of us, by simply being in this room today, we are in a privileged position to try and make a difference. Whether that is simply reporting instances of disinformation to the Real 411 platform, pointing out to friends or family where you see mistakes, everyone has a part to play. And so this is my clarion call to all of you to get involved in this fight against, in combating disinformation, because at the end of the day, it's just our democracy that might be at stake if we don't get this right. Thanks.
Thank you, Avni. I also forgot to mention that Avni is the chair of MMA's board as well, and we're very grateful to have her, and she does incredible work. Moving swiftly into our next topic, which is delving into the real-life consequences of AI for journalists in the newsroom. And we are joined today by Patiswa Mahopeni, who is the Executive Director of the Press Council of South Africa and has over 2 decades of experience in strategic, operational, and editorial leadership within the media sector. She serves as a board director of the SABC and is the vice chair of the African Women in Media Board of Directors. She's also the chair of the Network of Independent Media Councils in Africa and chairs the Executive Committee of UNESCO's Social Media for Peace Project in South Africa, and as well as being a member of the World Editors Forum, and a council member of the South African National Editors Forum. So, Patiswa, over to you.
I hope it's going to work. Does it work? Oh, okay. It's afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, MMA, in the person of William, to be specific, for leading the charge on this and ensuring that these conversations take place. It's one thing to know what's happening in the media landscape and the changes that are plaguing the media landscape. but it's another to actually organize such conversations to the extent that we're able to identify and find solutions to some of the problems that we experience. I think for me, sorry, the bit about the Press Council, where I work, it's a media oversight and accountability body with about 500 members across platforms. Our task, in short, is balancing media freedom and accountability and ensuring that there's also balance in how the media exercises its freedom of expression with responsibility. So this is fundamentally about ensuring that the rights and dignity of citizens are protected and respected in the practice of journalism. There's no doubt that this is a moment of profound transition. There have been several transitions before, and some overlapping. Journalism is being shaped not just by politics and power, but by code, data, and algorithms. Artificial intelligence has entered newsrooms with remarkable speed, with a promise of efficiency, precision, and predictive insight. Yet, beneath the optimism lies a quieter, less examined reality, the profound reshaping of journalism's ethical spine, professional identity, and democratic purpose. The current debates about its role in automation, productivity, and job losses are only fragments of a deeper story. It is the story of what journalism stands to lose that matters, which is its human soul. I want us to examine briefly some of the often overlooked real-life consequences of AI for journalists and newsrooms. The first consequence, and probably the most insidious, is the erosion of editorial and journalistic instinct and autonomy. AI-driven tools are now integral to editorial workflows, recommending story angles, headlines, and suggesting what is newsworthy. While these tools promise efficiency, they also risk diminishing the intuitive judgment of journalists. Human editorial instinct, which is built from experience, context, and ethical reasoning, is being replaced by algorithmic patterning. Slowly and subtly, algorithms are deciding what is newsworthy, and the journalist, once the agenda setter, is being reduced to a data interpreter. The question we must ask ourselves is, what happens to journalism when instinct and autonomy give way to automation? The second consideration is the invisible digital gatekeeping that occurs behind the scenes, where algorithms already shape what stories get told and whose voices are amplified. Newsrooms are increasingly relying on AI analytics and audience prediction systems to determine hot story angles, the stories that are sexy, to drive talkability value, which is essentially marketing. This fundamentally shifts editorial priorities towards engagement metrics over public value. The result is a creeping loss of journalistic and editorial sovereignty, where the power to define what matters migrates from journalists to digital tools. When we write to please algorithms instead of informing the public, our newsrooms become engines of optimization, not truth. Another real-life consequence is cultural and linguistic distortion, which emanates from the fact that most AI tools are trained on Western data and linguistic structures. For journalists operating in the African context, this creates an epistemic distortion as languages, idioms, and cultural references are flattened into data noise. This quiet digital colonialism threatens the authenticity of African storytelling and turns local nuance into global uniformity. I was excited when I listened to Helen in the previous panel talking about how they use polygamy to explain the arrangements of the GNU. I think it's a metaphor that we shouldn't lose because it actually grounds the explanations of what is happening in the news environment to the realities that Africans understand. There's something that I always pick up, particularly where isiXhosa is used. I know that it could be the case with other languages in news services that are offered for those languages. When you talk about an event that's going to happen, so they will say in 7 days' time or in a few days' time. But what you hear when it's translated, it will be, I could say, which is a direct translation of what the English says. And yet there's a beautiful metaphor that captures what is being said, which is actually, and Xhosa speakers understand exactly what that means. And it enriches not just the explanation, but the understanding of what is being said. So I do think that these are things that we need to go to. I've listened in most cases to some of those and in various radio stations where I understand the languages. So contextualizing information using metaphors and shared knowledge is an effective tool. That's beautiful and effective, but we are losing that resource. This also means that newsrooms relying on machine-aided translation for African languages news services have a greater responsibility to maintain the linguistic quality and integrity that's currently reserved for English news audiences. We need to care about African languages, and we need to care about African linguistic communities. Another reality to consider is the psychological and professional displacement of journalists. Synthetic media, such as AI-generated articles and visuals, blur the line between human and machine authorship. For many journalists, this creates a new form of existential anxiety, which is not about relevance, but about identity. When audiences can no longer tell who or what wrote the news, journalists face a crisis of legitimacy and emotional exhaustion that few institutions are prepared to manage. This is not merely a technical and operational issue, but a wellness concern. I've engaged with newsrooms on ethical issues around disclosing the use of AI in generating articles and visual material. The questions consistently revolve around the extent to which disclosures must be made and the impact on audience trust, professional displacement of journalists, and the erasure of journalistic effort. Newsrooms must address this issue with intention. Another point to note is that while there has been progress in developing policies and codes for ethical AI usage in newsrooms, knowledge gaps remain in their design, as some merely replicate existing ethical frameworks that are outdated. This is further complicated by insufficient training that is provided to journalists. For instance, when AI-assisted reporting without dedicated editorial oversight causes harm through misinformation, mislabeling, or bias, accountability becomes diffused. Who is responsible? Is it the journalist, the developer, or the newsroom? The answer remains elusive, creating an accountability blind spot that weakens both ethics and regulation. These ethical and accountability gaps must be addressed. The Press Council is also paying attention to these issues. The second last real-life concern as a consequence of AI for journalists in the newsroom is the silent deprofessionalization of journalism and the disintegration of the newsroom. The ability of AI to scrape and aggregate information and automate content creation poses a risk of reducing journalism to mere content production. Newsrooms driven by the need for speed and scale and facing pressures to sustain themselves and contain costs are gradually undervaluing field reporting, investigative depth, and editorial deliberation. This puts journalists at risk of becoming content operators, that is, being efficient but disposable. Currently, we are witnessing a raging debate on whether content creators are journalists or not, as well as their impact on journalism. We need to pause and think hard about the implications of this debate for journalism as an institutional field and journalists as guardians of the public record. At the same time, AI-driven newsroom workflows are diminishing the social and collaborative dimensions of newsroom life. Automated transcription, translation, and content sorting reduce interpersonal dialogue. Yet these are the very debates that once refined editorial due diligence, journalistic duty of care, and nurtured ethical culture in newsrooms. Slowly, the newsroom is becoming less of community of inquiry and more a chain of technology-mediated tasks. In all of this, we must ensure that information integrity is enhanced and human dignity is preserved throughout the media ecosystem amid AI challenges and regardless of the actors. Therefore, the other factor to consider is that generative AI has empowered peddlers of information disorders, this has been said already, and propagandists, and they fabricate reality with precision. Synthetic media such as deepfakes, synthetic audio, and automated narratives now challenge journalists to verify what is almost unverifiable. This requires additional oversight layers and responsibility and stretches newsrooms that are already struggling with limited resources. Also, as AI systems reward what performs well and not what matters in journalism, where newsrooms are chasing algorithmic success, diversity of narratives decline. And this is a huge problem because we're now seeing and observing homogenization of narratives. The subtle, local, and uncomfortable stories, as well as unexciting public affairs stories that sustain democracy, are being drowned out by pattern-based predictability of technology. As a result, the moral and cultural function of journalism to expand the public imagination is being quietly diminished. The front line of journalism has shifted from the field to the algorithm, which is a battle over truth itself. This requires not just retraining of practicing journalists, but also a complete overhaul of the journalism curriculum for those who are in the pipeline to be able to confront these challenges. But we must be careful to not train a generation of reporters who know how to prompt an AI bot, but not know how to interrogate power and pursue truth. So the real question is no longer whether AI will replace journalists, but whether journalists will still recognize themselves in the AI-shaped newsroom. The question is how journalism will retain its soul in an AI-enabled environment. Will journalists still have the space and courage to question, to feel, to resist, or are they going to adjust until truth itself become AI-generated quietly? We must bear in mind that while AI tools can write, summarize, and optimize, they cannot care. The cultural authority of journalism has never been in data and speed, but in its moral intent. AI can imitate and aggregate information, but it cannot replicate the conviction of the journalist behind it, because journalism is not a code base. In an era where machines can generate facts and blur truth, moral courage becomes journalism's most prized asset. It will take brave journalists through independent and thorough verification to question algorithms, resist manipulation, and defend inconvenient truths. While embracing the advantages of AI, we must ensure that journalism retains its essence, human judgment, and moral autonomy. To defend its soul, we must protect the right of journalists to pause, doubt, question, and decide. These are deeply human acts that algorithms cannot replicate. The integrity of journalism depends on ethical resistance and not technological obedience. While embracing the efficiencies of AI, journalists must resist becoming passive operators of systems that prioritize virality over veracity. Newsrooms must infuse technology with humanity, not surrender humanity to technology. It is stories that move societies because they connect emotion to fact, a power that no machine can truly grasp. The empathy, curiosity, and moral imagination of a journalist are becoming more critical for journalism that serves humanity. If we lose those, journalism will survive as an industry, but it will die as a public good. In conclusion, journalism is not merely about information, but humanity, and no algorithm, no matter how advanced, can ever replicate the moral courage to investigate corruption, interrogate power, and tell the truth. Therefore, it is not in the interest of journalists to compete with AI or similar technologies, which would be a waste of their valuable time, but rather to remind the world that truth still needs a human heart to tell it. That is the contribution of journalists and journalism to upholding the integrity of the news and information ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Patiswa, and I hope that everyone is keeping track of all of their questions so that we can engage with each of our speakers after the session is done. Moving swiftly on to the next topic, which is from constitutional talk to digital dialogue, media as a pillar of democracy. And taking us through that is Sandra Mujeni, who is a legal and development professional with expertise in human rights, the rule of law, and social justice, and the head of research at We the People South Africa. Her experience spans grassroots engagement and service with the United Nations in the Southern African Sub-Region Office. She brings skills in socio-legal research, project and knowledge management, communications and stakeholder engagement, and is committed to ensuring laws and policies translate into tangible benefits of marginalized communities. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone is still awake. So I am going to be taking you through history. What the organization I work for does is that it archives the story of the making of the Constitution and then teaches people about what the Constitution says and its impact on society. So, how was the Constitution written? There were 490 people who came together who were voted for in the first democratic elections of 1994 to be the first parliament and have the dual role to write the Constitution of South Africa. They were diverse in their makeup. We had people coming from exile. We had people coming from Robben Island. We had people representing different streams of society, trade unions, and those who were representing the different provinces coming together during this time. The motto was nothing above the heads and behind the backs of the people, meaning that they needed to think of a way to write this constitution that was inclusive. So the largest, still today, public participation program was established. And how they did that was that they needed to make sure that this constitution was going to be a legitimate constitution that represents the aspirations of the people. And the only way to do that is to include the people throughout the process. Now, I am going to be showing you different extracts from our archives from back then. Please watch this small clip from the SABC archives that teaches you about what this public participation program was like. I don't think we have sound. Okay. Are we able to get sound? It's coming, okay. Whilst we're waiting, I will tell you a little bit about this public participation program. So essentially, there were two departments that were in charge of this.
This program is brought to you by the Constitutional Assembly to help you understand the issues that are being debated in the process of writing our country's new constitution.
Good evening and welcome. We all know that we are at the close of the constitution-making process. One of its major successes is the unprecedented massive public participation. Tonight we are going to discuss the issue of public participation. But before we do that, let us view an insert that shows the highlights of public participation in the constitution-making process.
Following the elections in April 1994, the Constitutional Assembly was given the task of writing our new constitution. This meant the involvement of people across the country, from trade unions to children's rights activists. Public meetings were held countrywide to enable ordinary South Africans to say what they wanted in their constitution. Recommendations also came in from many organizations and civil bodies. The National Children's Rights Committee was one of the organizations that responded.
So, as you saw from that clip, it was massive public participation at its best. What they did was that they managed to get full funding. The Media Liaison Department had 35 million to spend within 18 months to undertake this public participation program. Like I said, this was the largest still today that's ever been done at that scale. The community liaison managed to reach over 1.2 million people to come into these public meetings, to give their opinions, to meet their first democratically elected politicians and discuss issues that they wanted to see changing in this constitution that was going to be written. 1,253 events were held with various organized formations. We're talking about over 1.5 organizations coming to the fold to discuss these issues, and an educational program that was rolled out as well to make sure that they went out and educated people about what this constitution was, what a Bill of Rights, what is separation of powers, for instance, so that people could adequately be informed to participate and give their opinions in what they wanted to see in the constitution. I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so the Media Liaison Committee or department, their take onto all this was a tagline that read, "You've made your mark, now have your say." They wanted media to be seen as more than just reporting, but rather as an educator and an extended outreach arm that reaches people. And like I said, I'm sharing archival material, so you can see Janet Love back in 1994 and her today. So the Media Liaison Committee made sure that they went out to inform the public, to educate, to stimulate public interest, and to create forums for public participation. And the way that they did this was through various forms of advertising in all forms of media, or what they had back in 1994, publications and resource materials, all in 11 languages. We now have 12, but then 11, and television and radio shows, and a massive, massive public relations outreach program. They reached 10.4 million listeners on local radio stations in 11 languages. They held 24 town hall talk format programs on SABC TV. There was 160,000 copies of the Constitutional Talk newsletter that was distributed nationally at taxi ranks and also at the post office. So even when they came up with the first draft of the Constitution, it was printed in 11 languages and put at the post office for people to collect, review, and give in their submissions of what they wanted to see changing. They used comic strips that they put into newspapers. So through the TV and the radio, we're talking about 10 million South Africans being reached. An evaluation was done by CASE at the end of 1996, and what they found was that 73% of all adult South Africans had been reached by this public participation program, more so in the urban than the rural areas. What they managed to do was to get between 2 and 3 million submissions from the public. And this was through a free post where people could go to the post office, go and collect the form, and then submit for free what they wanted to see in the Constitution. People wrote in their own languages, and the Constitutional Assembly and its functionaries had the job of translating this into English, making sure these issues were brought up into Parliament, where the Constitutional Assembly was debating on various issues to say this is what has come from the public. They had a toll-free line with Telkom where you could call to listen to messages that were pre-recorded, but also call to make your submission, for instance, if you couldn't read or write and wanted to just do it via the phone. The importance of language diversity, simplified explanation of constitutional terms was something that was key in this campaign. They used less text-heavy communication strategies. They used cartoons and comic strips. So that shows you that they were not just looking at traditional ways of communicating or traditional ways of learning and teaching, but making sure that they were reaching as diverse spread of the public as they could. So when we reflect on this process of public participation and the role that media played, we see that it's a true example of media fostering democracy. We see that it wasn't just a point of reporting on what was happening about the process, but ensuring that the citizens would own this process and be a part of this process, so that this constitution wouldn't be written for the people, but with the people. The South African media rights are one of the strongest protected rights in the world in this constitution. If we're looking at Section 16, which is freedom of expression, not only speaks about the public, but also speaks about the press and other media. Section 59 was actually brought out from the public participation program to ensure that in all governance and lawmaking, the public and press and media are allowed to be a part of that. Chapter 9 institution, an independent institution that keeps broadcasting and regulates broadcasting, was already put in there in 1994. My call to action in conclusion to everyone here today. I don't know if you know this, but 2026 is a big year. It's the 30th anniversary of the Constitution, and we have the chance to be involved in creating spaces for nation-building dialogues, to create awareness, to make sure that we create spaces where people can take stock, reflect, and give their opinion of where they want this country to go. An opportunity to use media creatively, an opportunity to encourage and inspire active citizenry. The media's role is not static. It evolves. We've been talking about AI and these new challenges with social media that we are facing today. However, the principle that remains is that access to information leads to participation, and participation strengthens democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. That was a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot, and I think you've highlighted the crucial role that the media plays in upholding our democracy really, really well. And I hope that people heed your call to action and that they become involved next year. Moving on to our next topic. As we all know, journalism is currently under threat across the globe, particularly also in different conflict areas, may that be Gaza, Sudan, Congo, and Ukraine, anywhere else on the planet. So to talk to us a bit about journalists as human rights defenders is Cassandra Dorosamy from Amnesty International South Africa. She is a campaigner at ISA and has previously worked on community development and health policy research. Over to you, Cassandra.
Thank you, Noor, and good afternoon, everyone. It's very special to be here and to be part of Media Freedom Festival for the first time. So thank you, MMA, for the opportunity. Like Noor mentioned, I work at Amnesty International South Africa, but we are part of a global movement that works so that everyone, wherever they are in the world, enjoys their fundamental human rights. For the past year and a half, we have been campaigning for greater protection of human rights defenders. And that campaign was born out of the experiences of human rights defenders from across the country that we have worked with. And from our observation that, like in many other areas of South Africa, the threats, attacks, and killings of human rights defenders have been continuing with impunity, and in some cases and areas have been increasing. So for example, this year will be 5 years since Mamfikile and Changase has been killed. And Mamfikile was an environmental human rights defender from the Somkhele region who was posing very fair, very important questions about the expansion of mining in her community. And for that, for standing up to defend her community's rights to be a part of this process and to resist it, she was killed in front of her grandson. 5 years, nobody has been held accountable. I'm sure many of you have heard about Abahlali Basemjondolo, which is a grassroots activist movement that fights for land, dignity, and housing for people living in informal settlements. This year was their 20th anniversary, and in their 20 years of existence, 25 of their members have been killed. There's only been accountability for 3 of those cases, and in some of those cases, their killing was directly because of their defense of human rights. But I think my core message here for this lightning session is that human rights defenders are not just people that we traditionally think of as activists in grassroots community organizations. Human rights defenders can be you and I. Human rights defenders are our whistleblowers. They are our lawyers, and they are especially our journalists. And human rights defenders, by its very definition in international law, is anyone who stands up and defends human rights for themselves or for their communities. And you may ask, why is this terminology important? Why do we need to have this overarching term of human rights defenders for the work that we do? And the reason for that is that there is an international framework that protects the right to defend human rights. It is derived from the UN Declaration on Human Rights that recognizes the right to defend human rights as a standalone right. You can click every time I say right. It creates obligations on the state to create an enabling environment for human rights defenders to carry out their work, including protecting their right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and to proactively address threats against human rights defenders. Now, as Noor mentioned at the start, across the world, we're seeing it becoming increasingly difficult for human rights defenders to do their work. And this includes journalists. I think it was recently shown that this has been, and sadly so, the bloodiest year for journalists because of the genocide in Gaza and the attacks on journalists in the Gaza Strip. And in this context, we might say, journalists in South Africa are protected. We have a great constitution, that Section 16, that protects the rights to freedom of expression. But unfortunately, through our work and through the work of our partners, we are seeing an increased threat to journalists for doing their work. And I'm sure many of you can attest to this, that when you come out with a story, there is online harassment, there's doxing, there's intimidation. There are political parties and people in power who start to raise concerns about journalists. And this all creates an environment of fear. It creates a chilling effect where journalists are now too afraid to do their work, or are just unable to perform their work without fear of that threat. And my colleague Genevieve Quintal, who is an editor and journalist herself, pointed out to me that in the past 3 years, there's been a decline of almost 40% in women specifically who are editors. And one of the contributing factors to that is that women receive particularly gendered, misogynistic attacks online when they do their work. And that chilling effect is something that is sliding and is an undercurrent in our country that isn't getting enough attention except for spaces like this. So to continue, there's a general call to action that we have with our partners, which includes SANEF and Lawyers for Human Rights, about the protection of human rights defenders. One component of that is for there to be legislation protecting human rights defenders. And again, that's journalists, that's grassroots activists, that's you and I, and anyone who does the work to protect human rights. If any one of us were to come under attack, there is an obligation on the state to have specific protections for human rights defenders. So our call is for there to be that legislation in place so that when HRDs come under threat or attack, there's an immediate response and immediate ability of the state to deal with the situation. The second component of that is something that a lot of speakers have been touching on today, and that's the digital aspect and the fact that big tech is part of this matrix of increased suppression of rights across the world. And it was very fortuitous that we have had Advocate Tlakula here today to speak with us, because the information regulator plays such an important role in holding social media companies accountable. And part of our work with our partner SANEF and LHR is looking at strengthening regulations of social media companies and ensuring their compliance with existing legislation, but also improving legislation to that standard that I think one of Nicole Fritz earlier mentioned was the EU regulation. There is already existing frameworks that we can lean into and use as a framework for us to strengthen our legislation in South Africa. So that is our secondary call. But our third call is broadly, if you or anyone else that you know who is doing the work of protecting human rights, if you are writing a story that is talking about service delivery, talking about corruption, if you know anyone else who's investigating, auditing, or any of these areas that are so important to upholding our democracy and good governance, reach out if you're experiencing threats. Don't sit, don't wait for threats to turn into something else, but reach out. There's CPJ that provides a referral network for journalists. There's Amnesty. We will be able to put you in touch with others who are doing the work of protecting journalists and other human rights defenders. But don't wait for the threats to escalate. Don't treat it as something insignificant. But we all need to make sure that when somebody is threatened or attacked for their work, that we are standing together and standing up to defend those who defend human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra. And last but not least, we will be looking at the topic of hacked attention, journalism in the age of algorithms. And taking us through that is Faranjis Gafoor, who is a science editor at, and I'm so sorry to the Germans in the crowd, I am going to butcher this, Tagesspiegel? Ready to move to Germany, where she reports on biomedicine, clinical psychology, and public health. With a master's in immunobiology and having been named one of Medium Magazine's top 30 under 30 in 2023, she also brings journalism to audiences via TikTok, Instagram, and other digital formats. She has tried to build a bridge between legacy media, news platforms, and evolving editorial forms. And she will be talking to us about hacked attention, journalism in the age of algorithms.
Hi, everybody. You can hear me clearly, right? Okay, great. Thank you first for having me. One of my tasks as an editor is also to think about, like, how do we engage better with our audiences? And I think the first thing to tell you, I do not have the plan how to outsmart the algorithms, but I have a few other ideas that we could use in the newsroom, and especially that publishing houses could use to get closer to the audience that they want to reach. I think when we talk about journalism in the digital age, we mostly talk about, like, we focus on visibility instead of focusing on trust. And I mean, journalism is fading from the public, but at the same time, people are constantly on their screens, but increasingly absent from their everyday reality. Like, at least this is my observation. And we have, like, kind of traded, this is what I see in legacy media, we have traded presence, journalistic presence, for performance, because this is what we're mostly talking about when we're talking about cross-media strategies, right? We talk about, like, oh, how can we, like, or let's tell the story as well on Instagram and on TikTok and in a podcast and in a newsletter, but we do it for performance, not because as legacy media we actually stand behind these platforms. But legacy media did in the past years, they successfully made this digital transformation, yeah? Like, we expanded reach, we multiplied formats, we built newsletters, we created podcasts, every newsroom has a TikTok team, has an Instagram team. But I think what we genuinely lost is the relationship between journalists and their audience. And this is, like, and I'm being for real here, I think this is the only privilege that we have compared to big tech. big tech will never ever, in a time where people psychologically report that they do feel lonely, that they do feel disconnected, big tech can never ever bridge this gap. This can only humans do. This can only proper journalists do. And I think this is something that we actually have to focus on, okay? Like, we spoke about Reuters reports and latest data, but like, what we see is like, we have this news fatigue, right? But like, this news fatigue does not mean that the audience is not interested in information. They want to know what's going on, but they can't process what's going on because there is an information overload, yeah? So the question that we as journalists have to tackle, in my opinion, is how can we as media rebuild trust and attention in a space that is dominated by algorithms? And one idea that has inspired me, it comes from an ecological perspective. It's called like media rewilding. I think it's really interesting. This concept basically means that in ecology, like you return species back to their natural habitat. And applied this to journalism, that means that journalists go back to the audience and they stop hiding behind screens. It's like, I think like even journalism, like an ecosystem, it depends on connection, and we have like built these strong digital infrastructures, but we haven't built real meeting points. I mean, you can ask yourself in your newsroom, like, do you have meeting points for your audience to get in and to get in touch with your reporters? Like, we do not have this in this capacity. And I think like there's some outlets that are experimenting. I can only tell you the German perspective. Like, we have this one outlet that's called Korrektiv. So they are anyways very local based, but they have started a cafe in which editors and journalists work, and people can go in and out and have a coffee, have a matcha, have a drink, whatever, have a cake. But you kind of get in contact out of sudden with the journalists and the editors that are reporting on you and that report for you, especially, yeah? Then we yesterday saw this like live journalism format with the Reporter Slam, where reporters share their stories and their research that they did on stage and have try a new way of storytelling. I think it like makes people feel the work behind the words, you know, and I think this is something that only we as humans can tell. Like, big tech would never be able to do this. But at the same time, I think like rewilding is not enough. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. I assume so. The BBC's user model, right? Like, inform me, help me, explain to me, and make me feel something, touch me emotionally. And I think also with this approach, what I experienced and observed, that in newsrooms, they see this user model and they still try to like run after a certain user need and think, okay, now we have to do stories only based on the help me need or the explainer need or something. But I think what we rather should do is like take this user model and nothing for granted. Like, there are no rules in journalism. Like, there are rules in journalism, but oops, hopla. There are rules in journalism, but I think there's no rule in storytelling, okay? And I think we can take these recipes that people present us and merge them. There's something that I would have loved to show you, but unfortunately on the technical side from our technician team in Germany, it didn't work out. But I recently developed a newsletter which is only 8 weeks long. Like, every week you receive a newsletter episode. It's science-based, like, since I do science journalism, but it's based or rooted in the help me user needs. So the subscriber gets an email for 8 weeks about like how to declutter the brain, and it starts with a very personal introduction. It's a personified newsletter. It's like branded on me. Then it goes to like explain a little bit of science, and then I present to the people a mind hack, and that is followed by a challenge. So we have different things combined in there, right? We have like this brand strategy of like journalists becoming more brands than just reporters. We have combined the user need and the explain me need. So you can take all these things and combine them. And I can't tell you yet if it's successful or not. Maybe it's not going to be successful. I don't know. But I think at least we're going to try to use this. It's just like, I think for me, what is really difficult as an editor is that I see in a time where journalism and like newsrooms don't have enough money. That also means that journalists do not have enough capacity anymore, right? Like, it is really hard to like write articles and research articles and write them in a way that you can justify to put them behind a paywall, and at the same time think about, oh, how can I tell the story in a transmedia way on Instagram and on TikTok and on YouTube and maybe even in a newsletter and also on a podcast. It takes up a lot of capacity, and I think this is something that is very underestimated from a publisher's side, that journalists don't just like sit there and research a story and can tell it easily on different platforms. Every platform has their strategy, and we have, unfortunately, have to bend the knee to the platform logic. You know, I think just to tell you a story, once it was so stressful for me that I started programming little GPTs to facilitate my work, and at the same time I felt like an imposter, because as a journalist, my job is not to create little GPTs and use AI to like do my work, right? Because this is then content creation, and content creation can be done by everybody, but journalism cannot be done by everybody. So what I want to advocate for is, like, instead of thinking how we can outsmart algorithms, we should rather think about how we can regain trust and how we can get closer to the audience that we want to report for. And I know sometimes it's really hard because not everybody is like well-intended towards us, but I think we have to be brave enough to accept that we aren't the ones that are gonna fight against big tech on their platforms. Like, they rule there, they're the kings, and I think we have to try to build new platforms. And from a psychological point of view, I would very much advocate for these meeting points to be in real life instead of being in a digital space. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you to each of the speakers in this session. They have taken us through some incredible topics, each of which we could have a whole 3-day conference on. So thank you for condensing these incredibly important topics into 10 minutes to give our audience an overview of these different topics. So now that's the exciting part, where you get to engage with our different panelists on the different topics. We're going to take first round of 3 questions. I think we'll do 2 rounds of 3. Please keep your inputs condensed, super quick comments, and just keep in mind that the longer that we are here, the longer people are away from lunch. So we're going to do first round of 3, and then responses from the panel and the speakers, and we'll take it from there. So I saw one hand in the back there. I recognize the hand, your hand, and then Neo.
No, thanks very much. Should you say chairperson or MC? I'm not sure.
Moderator is fine.
My name is Themba Spotukele. Like I said on Monday to those who are here, that I'm a recovering journalist. Today, I'm a perpetual student. I'm a learner. I'm learning because there's so much that I'm grappling with and trying to take home. And as much as we must condense everything, it's quite difficult. After so many speakers with so much information, it's quite difficult, but it's fine. I will try and summarize. One thing that I think in most presentations now is the psychological state of mind of journalists that we should think of. When, a newsroom are challenged on their own, we understand. And the last speaker now, I think, is Farajis, but I don't see properly, sorry. She mentioned the issue of, now, because I come from an old era newsroom. Now there's TikTok team, there's Instagram team, and the likes. That also puts stress on the mental health of journalists. It's something that we should look at very, very thoroughly. And Patiswa, the issue of the colonization of the journalism curriculum is quite important. And the question is, what's next? Based on your paper now and papers that were presented, I think there's so much that we are, personally, I'm suffering from information overload. And it's maybe, William, what's next? What do we do outside this theater? Because there's so much to chew, there's so much to involve, engage with academia, engage, because I can tell you, there are literally few, if there are, journalists from commercial media here. And that has been the case for years. So it's something that it's good to have these sessions, but how do we take this information out of these four walls? Thanks very much.
Sure, thank you.
Hello. This question's for Sispat as well, or anyone who wants to answer it. I'm Piladi Sutusa.
We can't hear you properly.
Hi, sorry. I'm Piladi Sutusa from the Wits Center for Journalism. This question is for Sispat Tiswa, or anyone else who wants to answer it. But you spoke again to the issue of including AI in the curricula, right? And I ask, well, my question to you is, ideally, what does that look like? Are you talking about ethical inclusion, overall inclusion? What kind of inclusion do you envision being helpful? And I ask because our students are at a point right now where they're already outsourcing so much of their thinking to AI that even valuing their own original work is something we have to fight for. So they don't see that inherent value in what they create, especially when they're on deadline or under pressure. So what does that curriculum look like in an ideal setting?
Thank you. And I think the last question is here in the back. It's Neo. Oh, no. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Neo. I just have two short questions. One is for Patiswa. Do you see I know there's a guidance note on generative AI for the press, but do you see the press code itself sort of requiring an indication on every single publication whether generative AI has been used? Because most people wouldn't go and read the terms and conditions of a website to see whether AI is used. And then for Avani, just with regard to electioneering, do you see legislation developing for especially the upcoming cycle of elections where politicians are sort of incentivized to correct misinformation, particularly in the context of deepfakes, because a lot of electioneering or deepfake content isn't actually created by the politicians themselves, but they wouldn't really have an incentive to take down incorrect information? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's start with you, Francis, and then we can go to Avni and then Patiswa.
Great. So I think I would start with the first question. First of all, please don't get me wrong. I think these platforms, call them what you want, but consumers have a desire to have Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and whatever, right? So I'm not advocating for abolishing them because it's too late for this now. But I think the question of what can we now do now that we heard all this input, I think at least from my viewpoint, is I think it requires some braveness of editors and publishing houses. But I have this I'm dreaming of a newsroom in which you have different teams that focus, for example, not on these general you don't have the general departments and sections that you have now with legacy media, but rather other topics. And in these teams, in a team, you research a story, you uncover one story, and then everyone has a different skill of storytelling for different platforms. So one person knows exactly how do we tell this kind of story for the specific audience that follows us on social media in a different way and pick out a different point than when we would do it when we create a printed text or when we tell the story in a podcast or when we tell the story in a newsletter. So I think I would really love to see a revolution in newsroom structures and in media structures. And I think who are those people that can lead the revolution? It can be people from the bottom, it can be editors, but I think it requires brave editors-in-chief, it requires brave publishing houses, it requires publishing houses to think about new marketing strategies. How do we market this? How do we frame this? How we tell the story around this? I mean, this is what marketing teams are responsible. So I don't think that editors have all the responsibility, but we can bring in ideas, and I think we should move fast and break things. Wow, who would have thought that I would ever use this phrase? It's horrible. But I think this is the only way that we can walk out of this and take the theoretical input and create something practical out of it. I haven't seen anyone doing this yet. I hope to see maybe one of you guys doing this in the future. I would love to join you in that.
Thank you. Before I answer Naya's question, I just want to quickly respond to the question around building it into the curriculum. I'm not, AI literacy into the curriculum. I'm not a journalist, so I'm kind of speaking from third, fourth-hand knowledge. But I do a lot of work with universities around building the policies. And two things that I think I've noticed is this kind of very stark, like almost polarization between the academics who are 100% on board with sort of the idea that students must be trained, for the future of work, and then on the other side, people who are very against it, very uncomfortable, and both sides have really important, arguments to make for it. But the reason I flag it is because of Patiswa's point around the level of trust that people have. In principle, AI disclosing the use of AI should be an important component, but there have been a number of studies showing that people trust the content less when it's seen to be disclosed, when it's seen to use AI. And I think part of that comes from also the education environment, but also, work environments and so on. It's still treated as it's felt as to be a naughty thing if you're using AI. It's something that's secretive, you should hide away. Whereas actually, if you are using it responsibly, if you're using it effectively, if you're using it, for instance, to collate information, to give you more time to spend on the analysis, that's incredibly important. But that's part of the skills, I suppose, that become quite difficult, but need to be filtered down to students as well. It also requires the lecturers to be trained on how to use it ethically and responsibly and so forth. Naya, to your question, so I kind of started working on elections kind of in earnest around 2019, and that was large part thanks to William, who one day at a meeting said, we need to do something about disinformation. And I nodded. And when I saw him the next time, he asked, so what are we doing? And so William, with his kind of mad genius way of going about it, we plotted the scheme that seemed far-fetched at the time through the form of the Real 411 and the partnership with the IEC and the platforms. And it really took flight. And we saw it especially coming to the fore last year, when the rise in disinformation and the types of content we were seeing was just overwhelming. I actively lose sleep over the idea of what we would have done if that had happened for the first time in local government elections. And so I 100% agree with you that part of the strategy has to be holding the political parties to account. And whilst I didn't get to it in the presentation, one of the legs to that is a proposal that with Media Monitoring Africa we have made to the Electoral Commission for an additional electoral code of conduct specifically on disinformation. And we've put a lot of thought into how we craft that, because you see the electoral codes are kind of binding between the IEC and the political parties. And so we've been careful in crafting it to also recognize that it may not be the candidate or him or herself kind of paying for the false information or paying the purveyor of disinformation, but recognizing that if it's sponsored on behalf of, if there's reckless disregard for verifiable information, if it's using of influencers, the net needs to be widened, and we need to make sure that there is accountability through the mechanism of the political parties and candidates. Part of the trouble is that the electoral code, whilst a really important instrument with incredible powers, has a massive deficit in the way in which it's able to be enforced. And I think that's part of the conversation in making this a reality.
Thank you. I think I have the most difficult questions, and I'm not sure why. I'm going to start with you, Themba. I just want to agree with you, because it's something that I've said, that the changes that we see in the newsrooms are actually triggering emotional anxiety. So it's not just the harassment of journalists that we've been dealing with in terms of wellness of journalists in the newsrooms. Now we are looking at other things that are happening that relate to operations in the newsroom that are triggering wellness concerns. So editors and media owners must actually take that into account and develop the right interventions for journalists. The other part that relates to decolonization of the curriculum, I hate this because it always feels like it's just hype whenever you hear the word decolonization of anything. It just feels like that. Usually at the end, nothing transpires. But in this case, I do think that the media sector needs to actually have a gathering and look at what's going on. And academics should be part of that conversation, because I've observed, I usually take time to go through what is available online as curricula that these universities and other institutions offer. It's out of date. Some of the stuff that you see there has no relevance to what the sector needs. It has no application beyond what is being taught in the newsrooms and discussions that emanate in that space. But in terms of practice, newsrooms are a different space now compared to what is still being taught at varsities or whatever institutions these journalists end up going to. So this is the point that I was making, that we actually need to make sure that journalists are not just trained on how to prompt bots. They still need to go back to what journalism is meant to do as a service to humanity. But related to that, there's a need for research that's grounded in African reality. You see this in reportage around court cases and grief. And in fact, there's been a recent one where, and it happens all the time, people are grieving, and it's the most uncomfortable thing to watch when you see cameras and mics being shoved at the faces of people who are mourning and who are grieving. Some have lost their children, some have lost their families. But when you ask, how do you feel? What do you expect that person to do? Do you expect that person to say she's happy or he's happy when you know exactly what that family is going through? So these are things that we need to take into account. There's a level where we need to look at the intellectual installations that happen at teaching level, because the theories that are being taught are based on foreign realities. And if you were to take just two concepts, dignity and respect, and juxtapose those in how we interpret them in the African context versus where they come from, you will actually find the most uncomforting or uncomfortable interpretations where the African sense of dignity and the African sense of respect is interpreted differently to a different context, which is where these frameworks are coming from. So we actually need to look at what the reality of the African context is and try and do research that informs our journalistic practice in the same context. The question that Peladi was asking about, how do we include AI in the journalism curriculum? And the perceptions that, which is a general perception that anyone can do AI. I have a problem with that, because one of the things that we need to do as the sector, we need to look at adjacent sectors and how they are approaching AI. And in fact, there's advanced research on the need to scope use cases for AI, even in the newsrooms, because other sectors have done that already. Medicine has been using AI to diagnose conditions, to treat patients, and yet we are sitting here thinking that asking ChatGPT or Perplexity or Copilot basic questions is going to give you what you want. And yet there's advanced research on AI. There's meso AI, because if you're going to scope your use cases, you need to decide which of the problems you're addressing in the newsrooms are going to be addressed through open AI, which is meso, and which is macro, and meso, which is industry related, and those that are specific to situations like micro interventions. So we need to look at adjacent sectors and not think that we are just going to muddle through and find ways of coping with AI challenges without actually doing the intellectual work for us to be able to do what needs to be done. So there is something that needs to be done in that space, but it's got to take a human rights-centered approach in the way we are going to train our journalists to use AI, bearing in mind that AI has no cognitive capacity. People can talk about, I mean, I've seen it saying it's reasoning when you ask it a question. It's still reasoning. What is being reasoned by? A synthetic medium. So you need to, we actually need to look at that. The right of reply, which is fundamental to journalism, is not something that AI is going to suggest to you. There's a journalist that has to intentionally look at what information is available, who's affected in the story, who actually needs to be given a right to reply? No algorithm is going to suggest that to you because it's not trained in that. So also the idea of critical literacies, there are three. Sometimes you talk about digital literacy, which doesn't really help if you don't have the fundamental ones. You still need information literacy as the basic, because information literacy is teaching you that actually at this point you need information in the first place. And then it's going to tell you where you must find that information. When you have found it, how do you evaluate the quality of that information or credibility of that information? And when you've done that, how do you use that information to the benefit or to address the need that you have identified in the first place? So without informational literacy, digital literacy means nothing, because you need to address the fundamentals. And you go to media literacy. How do I deal with all the media that's available to actually find the information that I need? There is a UNESCO media and information curriculum that 35 countries have adopted already, and it's compulsory at school. I mean, we have this life orientation school subject that no one knows what it teaches. This is actually where your middle curriculum should go, because surviving the digital age, it's actually requiring that kind of skill. It's becoming a survival issue, that you understand how the digital world works. So there are things that we actually need to consider in factoring in the curriculum, but specifically journalism, which is where you are coming from, there is scope and there is space for that to happen. The last one was on disclosure of generative AI usage and the position of the Press Council. We are working on what would serve our members as material or policies that would guide newsrooms in how to actually use AI in a manner that respects the public. But in this case, it can't be that we are sitting here and discussing whether we should disclose using AI or not. We should disclose it. We have in the past used stock images, and we used to disclose those. So why is it an issue now that we want to claim knowledge that we know we have not produced, instead of attributing that? And you know what? When you've done that, it also protects you. If there's a problem with that information, you've already disclosed that there was AI that you used. Yes, it could be that in your processes there was you overlooked some of the things that you should have verified. But it does give you some protection when you've disclosed that, actually, I used AI to produce this story. So there's a need to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Patiswa. Unfortunately, because of time, we can't take another round of questions, but hopefully our speakers are joining us for lunch. I'm just going to give Cassandra a quick 30 seconds to do a closing. Do you want to? No? All good. Sandra, anything from your side before we... Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We are going to break for lunch now, and we will be back in an hour. We have an incredible session that will be happening after lunch on developing a People's Digital Rights Charter. So I would encourage everyone to come back here for that session. And then tonight, we have, as Thandi and William have already mentioned, an incredible session with Dan Corder, who will be outlining a vision for the future of our media. And we'll have Patiswa and also Naeem Gina from Mistra, who will be responding to him, as well as a very exciting announcement from MMA. So I would encourage everyone to enjoy lunch, but also be back later to join us for the rest of our sessions. Thank you, and thank you to all of our speakers.